In the autumn of 1908, a five-man demolition crew arrived at what remained of the Ravenel Bluff Plantation in the South Carolina Lowcountry. Their task was straightforward: bring down the last standing cabin on the property. But the moment their crowbars bit into a wall that had been nailed shut, tarred over, and whitewashed 3 separate times across 45 years, the job became something else entirely. The man who had ordered that wall sealed in March of 1863 had long since turned to dust. His widow had passed the previous winter. The deed to the land had changed hands 4 times over the decades. And with each new owner came the same assurance from the Ravenel family's former overseer. The little cabin at the edge of the rice field could be demolished, but under no circumstances was it ever to be opened. When that first board finally gave way on that October afternoon, the foreman recoiled instantly. The odor that poured out into the pine-scented air was unlike anything he had ever encountered. 2 of the younger workers crossed themselves without thinking. The eldest among them, a freedman named Solomon Pinckney, born on a neighboring plantation in 1847, set down his crowbar and spoke very quietly. He said he had spent 60 years waiting to learn what lay on the other side of that wall. What they uncovered inside that cabin would pull a county coroner out of retirement, generate a flurry of newspaper articles that were withdrawn from circulation within 3 weeks, and expose a crime the Ravenel family had spent 2 generations and a considerable fortune trying to conceal behind pine boards and Sunday piety. Before we proceed with the full telling of Ravenel Bluff and the cabin sealed since 1863, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Drop a comment telling us which state you're listening from right now. Hearing where you are across the country reminds me why these stories must never be forgotten. Now, to understand what lay behind that wall, we have to go back to the spring of 1849, when Ravenel Bluff was still counted among the most successful rice plantations along the tidal stretch of the Combahee River. The plantation sat on a high bank of sandy loam, overlooking nearly 300 acres of flooded rice fields. To the east stood a thick stand of cypress and live oak, draped in Spanish moss. To the west, a low tidal creek filled and drained with the salt-pulled rhythm of the Atlantic. The air in the low country that spring was heavy with the smell of mud and blooming jessamine. At night, the rice fields echoed with the croaking of bullfrogs and the slow, steady clicking of rice birds descending from the Carolina Piedmont to feed on the spring plantings. To the north, the Combahee River flowed between its banks of black water and tangled palmetto, its surface broken every few yards by the log-still shapes of alligators basking in the long afternoon light. This was the geography of the antebellum South, one of the wealthiest stretches of land in the Republic. A single acre of Combahee rice, at the price it fetched in the Charleston markets of 1849, was worth more than most free white farmers in the upcountry earned in a year. The main house was a 2-story Greek Revival structure, painted the specific shade of white that only the very wealthy could afford to maintain in that humid climate. Its columns were carved from heart pine, and its long verandas were shaded by the same live oaks that had already been old when the first European settlers passed through the region in the 1690s. The interior was furnished with pieces Augustine Ravenel's grandfather had shipped from Philadelphia and New Orleans: mahogany writing desks, a broadwood pianoforte in the front parlor, a sideboard of French walnut carried down from Richmond on a coastal schooner in 1811. The floors were heart pine, the walls plastered and painted the color of old cream. Above the dining room fireplace hung an oil portrait of Augustine's father, Colonel Pierre Ravenel, who had served under General Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. He stared down at every family meal with a severity that Augustine Ravenel, as a boy, had found difficult to bear. Behind the main house, arranged in a neat double row along a packed earth lane, stood the plantation's 12 slave cabins. They were small structures of rough-cut cypress plank, roofed with hand-split shingles, each one housing between 4 and 8 human beings who, under the laws of South Carolina in that year, were considered the personal property of Mr. Augustine Ravenel. The cabins had packed earth floors, a single hearth at one end, and small unglazed windows covered at night with oiled cloth. In the summer, they were thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and the resinous breath of the pine forest beyond the fence. In the winter, they were cold enough that the children slept 3 to a pallet for warmth. Between the cabins and the main house ran an invisible line that every person on the plantation understood without ever having it explained. One side was the world of the Ravenel family, a world of ledger books, Sunday dinners, and letters written on cream-laid paper. The other side was the world of work and survival, and the long memory of a people who had been brought to that place from a continent most of them had never seen and would never see again. Augustine Ravenel was 46 years old in the spring of 1849. He was the third of his family to hold the plantation. Descended from a Huguenot merchant who had fled France in the 1680s and settled in Charleston before pushing inland to the rice country. Augustine was a tall, narrow-shouldered man with sand-colored hair going gray at the temples, and a habit, noted by every neighbor who ever had supper at his table, of chewing the inside of his cheek when displeased. His wife, Henrietta Bonneau Ravenel, was 7 years his junior, educated in the French manner at a finishing school in Charleston, and known among the wives of the Lowcountry gentry for her fierce adherence to the proprieties of her class. They had 3 children, a daughter, Clotilda, who was 12 that spring, a son, Augustine Jr., who was 9, and a younger boy, Lawrence, who was 4. The plantation held by the census of that year 47 enslaved people. Among them was a man named Ezekiel, who was the head driver of the field hands. Born on the plantation in 1809, his father before him had been brought in chains from the windward coast of Africa in 1787. Ezekiel knew every inch of the rice fields, every working of the trunk gates that controlled the tidal flow, every name of every person who lived in the cabins, and the unspoken hierarchy of the enslaved community. He was the man to whom the others turned when a child fell ill, or when a dispute needed settling without the overseer's involvement. He was 40 years old in the spring of 1849. A broad-shouldered man with hands so calloused he had lost most of the feeling in his fingertips, moving through the world with the careful patience of a man who had learned very young never to waste emotion or a word. There was a woman named Clarissa who ran the kitchen, and who was considered by Henrietta Ravenel to be indispensable. Clarissa was 52 that spring. She had been a girl of 8 when she was bought by Colonel Pierre Ravenel at the Charleston market in 1805, separated on that same afternoon from her mother, whose name she could no longer remember by the time she reached middle age. Over the decades, Clarissa had made herself the most skilled cook in the parish. Her shrimp pilau was famous from Beaufort to Charleston. She baked Ben wafers that Henrietta served to the visiting wives of state senators. She knew every herb in the kitchen garden, every remedy for a child's fever, every measure of every ingredient in every recipe she had ever learned. And she knew, too, how to listen. The kitchen was where the main house and the quarters met, and Clarissa had spent 44 years of her life standing at that intersection, hearing everything that passed between the two worlds and remembering it. And there was a young woman named Delia, 18 years old that spring, whose mother had died of fever the year before. Delia had been assigned to the main house, serving as nursery maid to the youngest Ravenel child. She was tall for a woman of her time, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed older than her years, and a careful stillness about her that her fellow servants had learned to respect. She did not speak unless addressed. She did not laugh where it could be heard, but she sang very softly to the little boy Lawrence when she put him to sleep at night, old songs in a gula patois her grandmother had brought from the sea islands. The child would fall asleep with his hand curled around one of her fingers, as if he had always known her. Delia's grandmother, whose name had been Bina, had told her as a child that the songs were older than any of them, older than the plantations, older than the ships, and that as long as there was a child in the world who could still hear them, they would not die. Delia had believed her. Singing those songs over the cradle of a white child who was not her own was, in some private corner of her mind, the only way she had of keeping her grandmother alive. The Ravenel family did not think about Delia. They did not think about any of the people who served them. The machinery of the plantation was simply there, the way the tide was there, the way the heat was there, the way God was said to be there. Henrietta Ravenel recognized her house slaves by face and function, but she could not have told you the name of a single field hand. Augustine kept better records, but only because records were money. In his study, in a leather-bound ledger stamped with the family crest, he wrote down every purchase, every birth, and every death among the people he owned in the same neat column as the purchases of livestock and the prices of seed. There was no difference in the architecture of his mind between the two. On a plantation of 47 souls, one young woman in a cotton head wrap who sang to the baby was less visible than the furniture she dusted every morning. The politics of the Lowcountry in 1849 were already beginning to tighten around the edges of this world. In the Charleston newspapers delivered to Ravenel Bluff by courier every Wednesday, Augustine read with increasing frequency about abolitionist agitation in the North, about the debates over slavery in the new Western territories, about the fury of Senator Calhoun and the nervous calculations of the great cotton planters. The nullification crisis of the 1830s was still a recent memory. The Mexican War had just ended. The Compromise of 1850 was a year away. Augustine Ravenel, like most of his class, believed with a conviction that admitted no argument that the Southern way of life was divinely sanctioned and economically necessary, and he was prepared, if necessary, to defend it. He did not yet know that within 12 years his country would split in two over the precise question of whether he should be permitted to continue to own the woman who dusted his desk. And Delia, who knew nothing of the debates in Washington, continued to sing to his youngest son in the nursery, making the little boy laugh and keeping him alive through the fevers of his first years, because that was what she had been assigned to do, and because the boy, in his own way, had become the thing that made her own life bearable. This was the ordinary world of Ravenel Bluff in the spring of 1849, a world of rice and rhetoric, of mint juleps on the veranda and Sunday sermons at the parish church in Beaufort District, of neat ledger books in Augustine's study, recording every bushel, every birth, and every purchase, both of livestock and of people. It was a world its inhabitants believed would last forever. It was a world about to crack open along a seam no one in the main house had yet seen. The crack began in the summer of 1852, when Augustine Ravenel's youngest son, Lawrence, died of yellow fever. He was 7 years old. The fever came to Beaufort District that summer in one of the worst outbreaks the region had seen since the epidemic of 1817. It moved through the low-lying plantations along the Combahee River, the way fever had always moved in that country, through the mosquito-thick air of August dusk, striking the youngest and oldest first. At Ravenel Bluff, it took 3 people in the course of 2 weeks. An elderly field hand named Old Moses died on August 11th. A 4-year-old girl in the second cabin died on the 15th, and on the morning of the 21st, little Lawrence Ravenel woke with a flushed face and a temperature that made Delia's hand jerk back when she touched his forehead. The boy lasted 8 days. For the first 3, he alternated between fever and shivering, asking for his mother, who could not be reached in time, and for Delia, who did not leave his side. By the 5th day, the disease had entered its second phase, the yellowing of his eyes, the retching of black matter that gave yellow fever its old name of vomito negro. Delia, who was 21, held him through each convulsion with a steadiness the household physician, Dr. Franklin Leland, later described in a letter to Henrietta Ravenel as remarkable. When Lawrence could no longer speak, Delia held his hand and sang to him the same song she had sung when he was an infant. She sang about the river that ran to the sea, about the woman who became a bird. She sang until her voice gave out, and then she hummed, and then she simply held him. Henrietta Ravenel was in Charleston when the child died, visiting her sister. Augustine was in the study. It was Delia who closed the boy's eyes, who washed his small body with rose water, who wrapped him in the linen set aside for the purpose, and who did not cry in front of the physician, because she knew no one in the main house would ask her to. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the main house. Henrietta returned from Charleston 3 days after her son's burial, collapsed in the front hall, and had to be carried upstairs. She did not leave her bedroom for nearly 4 months. The nursery curtains were drawn. The toys were wrapped in muslin and packed away in a trunk. The house was draped in black crepe. The mirrors turned to the wall, and the mantel clocks stopped at the hour of the boy's death. Augustine, who had been distant from his children for most of their lives, began to spend long hours in the nursery where his youngest son had died. Sitting in the rocking chair Delia had once used, he drank more than he ever had, slept badly, and snapped at his daughter Clotilda, who was 15 that summer and had begun to fear her father in a way she never had. And Delia, who had nowhere else to go, was often in that same nursery, folding small clothes that would never be worn again, dusting a rocking horse that would never be ridden. What happened between them in that nursery over the course of the next year did not happen because either of them chose it, not in any sense a free person would recognize as choice. Augustine Ravenel was the man who owned her. Under the laws of South Carolina in 1852, there was no such thing as the rape of an enslaved woman by her enslaver, because the word rape required a violation of the victim's will, and the law did not recognize that an enslaved woman possessed a will that could be violated. This was not a private opinion of the Ravenel family. It was the written law of the state, upheld by every court in the republic south of the Mason-Dixon line, most infamously articulated by Judge Thomas Ruffin of North Carolina in the case of State v. Mann in 1829. When the judge wrote that the power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect. Under the cover of that law, under the cover of his wife's grief, under the cover of the quiet rooms of a house draped in mourning cloth, Augustine Ravenel began a relationship with the young woman who had held his dying son. Delia did not fight him. A woman in her position did not fight, because a woman in her position who fought would be whipped, sold, or worse. She did what she had always done. She went still, went silent, sang one of her grandmother's old songs in her own mind, and waited for it to be over. When she walked back to her cabin afterward, in the darkness of the lane between the quarters, she walked without making any sound at all. She had learned by the age of 22 that the body could be separated from the self if you were careful. If you were very careful, and if you kept it singing in the autumn of 1853, Delia was pregnant. She was 22. She told no one. The other women in the cabin saw the shape of her body changing under her apron and knew. The way women have always known. Clarissa, who ran the kitchen, took her aside one evening behind the smokehouse and asked whose it was. Delia did not answer. She did not have to. Clarissa had lived on Ravenel Bluff for 31 years. She had seen this before. Seen what happened to the women it happened to. Seen what happened to the children. Clarissa, who had buried 3 of her own children and watched a 4th sold away to a plantation in Alabama when the girl was 12, looked at Delia for a long time in the red light of the setting sun. Then she took the younger woman's hand in her own and said that whatever happened, she would help her. She said it quietly once, and then went back to the kitchen and did not speak of it again. The child was born in the spring of 1854 in the slave quarters, in the smallest cabin at the end of the row, which had been given to Delia after her mother's death. The midwife was an elderly woman named Grace, who had delivered more than 100 babies on that plantation and the surrounding ones over her long life. The labor was long. Delia made almost no sound. When the child came at last, just before dawn on a morning in early April, he came quietly, with his eyes open, looking at the lantern as if he had been expecting it. It was a boy. Delia named him Isaac after her grandfather, who had been brought to the Sea Islands on a ship whose name no one in his family had ever known. The child was light-skinned, with hair the color of wet sand, and eyes that would, as he grew, turn the same pale gray as Augustine Ravenel's. When Grace saw the child, she looked at Delia and did not need to ask. She washed the baby in a basin of warm water, wrapped him in a clean linen cloth, placed him in his mother's arms, and sat down on the wooden stool beside the bed, saying very softly that the child had the look of someone whose life would need to be guarded carefully. Delia nodded. She already knew. Henrietta Ravenel knew, too. She could not know. The child was too obvious, the plantation too small, the eyes of the other servants too knowing for her to pretend otherwise. For several weeks after Isaac's birth, Henrietta did not come down to breakfast. When she finally did, on a morning in late April, she did not speak to her husband across the table. not in any meaningful way for almost a year, but Henrietta was a woman of her class and time, and the solution to a problem of this kind among the planter families of the Lowcountry was not to acknowledge it. Divorce was impossible. Scandal was unthinkable. The solution was to keep the mother in the cabin at the far end of the row, to pretend the child belonged to some unnamed field hand, and to wait for the years to soften the outline of the resemblance into something that could be politely ignored. For 8 years, that was what they did. Delia raised Isaac in the cabin at the end of the row. Augustine continued intermittently, and with a pattern only Delia and Clarissa would have recognized, to visit her. Henrietta lived in the main house, conducted her social calls, took the sacrament at the parish church, and did not speak her husband's name in connection with the child in the cabin. Isaac grew. He learned to walk, to talk, and from the other children in the quarters, the careful art of becoming invisible whenever a white person passed. By the time he was 7, he was the quietest child on the plantation, but also, in the private geography of his mother's cabin, a child who laughed. Delia had carved out a small world for him, with Clarissa's help and the help of the other women of the quarters, a world entirely his own. She taught him to read in secret from a torn Bible. Clarissa had smuggled out of the main house and sewn into the lining of Delia's mattress. She taught him to count using dried beans in a kitchen jar. She taught him the old songs. And she taught him, in the careful language an enslaved mother used to teach her son to survive, when to speak and when to be silent, when to bow his head and when to meet a white man's eyes, when to laugh and when to hold his face as still as a pond at dawn. By his 8th year he had learned all these lessons. He was a quick child and a watchful one. Delia sometimes watched him sleeping at night in the yellow light of a single tallow candle and thought, with a kind of grief she had no word for, that he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that the world into which he had been born was going to destroy him, and that she could not imagine a future in which this would not be true. Ezekiel, the head driver, was one of the few people on the plantation who spoke to the boy directly. In the long evenings of spring and summer, when the work of the day was done, Ezekiel would sometimes come to the end of the lane where Delia's cabin stood, sit on the wooden step outside the door and tell Isaac stories. He told him about the river, the birds, the way the tide worked, and in a careful, coded way about places up north where a man could be free. He did not say the word freedom. He did not have to. Isaac, small and thin, watching the older man with gray eyes already old for his age, understood what was being described. Delia, listening from inside the cabin, said nothing. She was afraid of what Ezekiel was telling her son, and she was afraid of what would happen if he did not tell him. Then, in the summer of 1862, everything changed. The war had come to the Sea Islands. The Union Navy had taken Port Royal the previous November, landing troops on Hilton Head and the surrounding islands, sending the white population of the region fleeing toward the interior. Confederate planters up and down the coast were beginning to understand that their world was ending. The great Sea Island plantations had been abandoned. The enslaved people left behind had been declared contraband of war by General Benjamin Butler, and then, in January 1863, declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. News of all this reached the plantations along the Combahee River through channels the planters could not control, the kitchens, the stables, and within days the cabins. Augustine Ravenel, now 59 and having lost 30 pounds in the last year, began to drink in the evenings in a way his wife and daughter pretended not to notice. He sat up late in his study with ledgers open, staring at columns of figures representing a form of wealth about to be taken from him. He wrote long letters to his banker in Charleston, to his brother-in-law in Richmond, and slept, when he slept at all, in the chair by the study fire with a pistol on the desk beside him. The field hands were beginning to disappear, slipping away at night toward Union lines, no amount of patrolling able to stop them. In April 1862, 3 young men from the second cabin left together and were never heard from again. In June, a woman named Hannah and her 2 daughters simply were not in their cabin when the bell rang at dawn. Ezekiel, the head driver, who had been with the family since before Augustine inherited the plantation, walked into the woods on the night of August 9, 1862, and never came back. He had, in the preceding weeks, begun to speak more openly to the younger men about what was coming. Then, on one warm night, he simply stepped out of his cabin and was gone. He was 53. He left behind a wife named Chloe, who would eventually find him again in the fall of 1864 at a contraband camp outside Beaufort, and who would die in his arms of pneumonia in the winter of 1867. A free woman on free land, Augustine Ravenel began to be afraid, a specific, nameable fear. He was afraid of what would happen when the Union Army came, and he knew now it would come. He was afraid of his ledgers being read by Yankee officers. He was afraid of his neighbors, several of whom had already begun to whisper about him in Beaufort society, about the child at the end of the quarters row, about the resemblance no longer deniable as the boy grew older, and in a way he had not previously permitted himself to think. He was afraid of Delia and the child Isaac, now 8, whose face was a daily public record of something Henrietta had spent 9 years pretending did not exist. The war was about to make Delia a free woman, and a free Delia could testify. A free Delia could write her own name if she chose on a piece of paper any Union officer in the region would read with interest. A free Delia, holding the hand of a light-skinned boy whose features mirrored one of the most prominent planters on the Combahee, was no longer a private shame to be managed behind a plank wall. She was a witness, and witnesses, in the calculation of a man like Augustine Ravenel, were not problems to be reasoned with. They were problems to be solved. In the autumn of 1862, Augustine Ravenel began to make arrangements. He told his wife one evening in October that Delia had grown insolent and it was time to sell her away. Henrietta, who had been waiting for this conversation for 9 years, did not argue. She asked only that it be done quickly, and that the child go with her. Augustine agreed. He did not, however, make contact with any slave trader. The ports were blockaded, the auction houses in Charleston were empty, and Augustine had begun, in the long evenings of that autumn, to calculate a different sort of arithmetic. What happened next is the heart of what the men found behind the wall in 1908. The part of this story the Ravenel family spent 45 years and 2 generations trying to hide. I want to pause here for a moment to ask you, if this story is pulling you in, hit that like button and leave a comment with your thoughts so far. The algorithm only shows these stories to more people when you engage, and there are descendants of families like Delia's all across this country who deserve to have their histories heard. Keep watching, because what I am about to tell you is the piece of the story Augustine Ravenel paid to keep buried. On the night of January 17, 1863, according to the testimony Solomon Pinckney would give to the Beaufort County coroner on October 29, 1908, Augustine Ravenel came to the cabin at the end of the row with a bottle of imported French brandy, a folded document bearing the seal of a Charleston notary, and 2 men from a neighboring plantation Solomon did not recognize. Solomon was 15 at the time in the neighboring cabin, separated from Delia's by a single plank wall, and he heard everything. His grandmother, a woman named Flora, who had raised him after his mother's death, was asleep on the other side of the small room, worn down by a cough that would kill her before winter's end. Solomon was wide awake. He had been wide awake on most of the nights of that January. He was a boy who listened. Augustine told Delia he had purchased her freedom. He showed her the notarized document. He told her he had arranged for her and the boy Isaac to be taken by wagon that night to a safe house in Walterboro, and from there to Charleston, where they would board a ship bound for Liverpool. He said the war would be over soon and she could not be here when it ended. He said he had provided a sum of money sufficient to begin a new life. He asked her to pack what she needed and to wake the boy. Solomon, through the wall, heard Augustine's voice clearly. The voice of a man trying to sound generous, and at the same time, a man who had made a decision he did not intend to unmake. Solomon had heard that voice many times in his short life. It was the voice white men used when they had already decided the outcome of a conversation, and it did not matter what the other person said. Delia did as she was told. Solomon heard her through the wall, moving quietly in the dark, telling the child in that low singing voice that they were going on a journey, that he should be brave, that he should be very quiet. He heard her wrap a small bundle of clothes, strike a match to light a candle stub so she could find the child's shoes. He heard the child ask if they were going to see the ocean. He heard her say yes, they were going to see the ocean. Solomon, in the dark of his own cabin, began to pray. He did not know precisely why. He could not have articulated what was wrong. But something in the arrangement of voices on the other side of the wall had set a cold weight in his chest that would not lift. Then Solomon heard the two men from the neighboring plantation come into the cabin. What happened in that cabin in the next half hour is the thing the wall was built to hide. Solomon, through the plank wall, heard it all. The child cried out once, a small, high sound of surprise more than fear, because the child had not yet understood what was about to happen. Delia screamed, a single scream, cut short, a sound he could not describe to the coroner 45 years later without stopping and asking for water. A heavy sound, a wet sound, and then a second, smaller version of the same sound. And then, for a very long time, silence. Solomon did not move. His grandmother slept on through it all because she was old and her cough had exhausted her. And because the human body will sometimes refuse at the end of a long life to wake for sounds the waking mind could not survive. Solomon lay in the dark with the cold weight in his chest, and he did not cry and he did not move. And he listened to the silence on the other side of the wall, as if he could, by listening hard enough, will it to become something else. It did not. Before dawn, Augustine Ravenel and the two men left the cabin. They went to the carriage house, returned with tools, and for the rest of that night, and into the gray of the next morning, Solomon listened through the wall to the sound of hammers, boards being nailed across the inside of the door, tar brushed over the seams, and a wooden bar driven across the outside of the cabin, sealed with nails as long as a man's hand. When Solomon dared, near noon, to look through a knothole in his own cabin wall, he saw three men whitewashing the exterior of the sealed cabin with a slurry of lime and pine tar. Their faces were set in a way that told him, even at 15, they were not men who had done something they would admit to in daylight. Augustine Ravenel told the remaining enslaved people that Delia and her boy had been sold in the night to a trader bound for Cuba. He said the cabin had been sealed because of fever. He said no one was to go near it, and anyone caught near it would be whipped within an inch of their life. Then, because the war was coming and there was no time for sentiment, he moved on. 6 months later, in July 1863, Augustine Ravenel was dead. He had been thrown from a horse on the river road, his neck broken against a fence post, and he died where he fell, with no last confession, no last arrangement, no last alteration to the will he had signed in 1861. His widow, Henrietta, inherited the plantation. The Union Army reached the Combahee River in the late summer of that year. During the raid led by Harriet Tubman and Colonel James Montgomery, 32 of the remaining 39 enslaved people at Ravenel Bluff walked away toward the gunboats and were free. Solomon Pinckney was among them. He was 15. For the next 45 years, the sealed cabin at the end of the row stood where Augustine Ravenel had left it. Henrietta Ravenel, who lived until the winter of 1907, never spoke of it. Her surviving children, Clotilda and Augustine Jr., grew up knowing only that their father had ordered the cabin sealed because of fever and that it was not to be touched. When Clotilda married a Charleston physician in 1868 and moved away, she did not look back at it. When Augustine Jr. inherited the plantation in his mother's last years, he did not look at it either. The cabin was whitewashed a second time in 1881 during a general repainting of the outbuildings, and a third time in 1899 when the plantation was first put up for sale. Each time the workmen were told by the estate's overseer, an old man named Claiborne Huger, who had served the Ravenels since before the war, that the cabin was to be painted over but never opened. Claiborne Huger died in 1906. He took what he knew with him. Decades passed. The fields grew up in pine saplings and broom sedge. The main house, grand in 1849, settled and sagged on its foundations by 1908. The plantation had been sold twice and was in the hands of a timber company out of Savannah that had no use for it except to harvest the last of the live oak and pine and then subdivide the rest for small farms. The timber company hired a local foreman named Edgar Fripp to tear down the outbuildings, and Edgar Fripp hired a crew of 5 men. On the morning of October 27, 1908, that crew came down the old packed earth lane between the rows of collapsed cabins and arrived at the one at the end of the row. The one whitewashed 3 times, standing slightly apart from the others. The one no one in Beaufort County could remember ever having seen opened. Edgar Fripp, a practical man not given to superstition, told his crew to knock it down. He did not know about the wall built on the inside. He thought it was just another slave cabin, of which there were dozens on dozens of abandoned plantations up and down the coast, and that it would come down in 20 minutes. Just when we thought we understood the story of Ravenel Bluff, the horror sealed inside that cabin is about to come out into the daylight for the first time in 45 years. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark American history. Hit that like button to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. What Edgar Fripp's crew was about to find will change everything. The first blow of the crowbar against the outer wall of the cabin came at just after 11 in the morning. The planks splintered easily. The wood was old cypress, cut from the river bottom 60 years before, and it gave way with the dry crack of something that had been waiting a long time to fall. The second blow took down a second board. The third exposed what at first seemed to be a second wall, perhaps 18 inches behind the first, nailed up from the inside with boards of the same cypress plank, seams sealed with black tar hardened to the consistency of stone. The men paused. They had all seen the outside of the cabin whitewashed 3 times over, but none had expected a second wall. Edgar Fripp stepped forward, ran his hand along the inner wall, pulled back his fingers and smelled them. Then he looked at Solomon Pinckney, the oldest man on the crew and the only one who had been alive in 1863. The younger workers who had started the morning joking about how quickly the job would go had fallen completely silent. One, a man named Jessup, took off his hat and began to turn it slowly in his hands. Another, the youngest, a boy of 19 named Caleb, stepped back from the cabin without seeming aware he was doing it. The autumn light fell slant through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called 3 times and stopped. Solomon, who had been waiting for this moment for 45 years, said nothing. He took the crowbar from the younger man nearest him, walked up to the inner wall, set the bar against the seam between 2 boards, and pulled. His hands, grown old on their own schedule, were shaking. He had to set the bar a second time to get leverage. When the board finally came loose, it came away with a long tearing sound, like cloth being torn in half. The smell that came out was not the smell of fever, nor of any illness Edgar Fripp had encountered in his 41 years. It was the dry, dusty, faintly sweet smell of something sealed in darkness for nearly half a century, carrying the particular and unmistakable weight of the human dead. It was, Edgar Fripp would later say in an interview never published, a smell a man could recognize even if he had never smelled it before, because some part of the human mind knew it the way the body knew hunger or thirst. Solomon Pinckney, who had smelled it before in the hospitals of the war years, took 2 steps back from the opening and sat down on a fallen log. His face had gone gray. Edgar Fripp ordered the crew to stop. He sent the youngest worker, Caleb, running on foot 2 miles through the pine woods to the nearest telephone at the general store at Green Pond, with instructions to call the Beaufort County Sheriff and the county coroner. Then Edgar Fripp, Solomon Pinckney, and the 3 remaining men sat down on the ground 20 feet from the cabin and waited. No one spoke. Solomon, according to an account later given to a reporter from the Charleston News and Courier, took off his hat, held it in both hands, and did not put it back on for the rest of the afternoon. Jessup, a Methodist, prayed quietly under his breath. Edgar Fripp, not a religious man, smoked 3 cigarettes in succession and stared at the broken wall as if trying to memorize it. A squirrel ran down the trunk of the nearest pine, saw the men, and scrambled back up without a sound. The sheriff, whose name was Oscar Hayward, arrived at Ravenel Bluff just after 2 in the afternoon, accompanied by the county coroner, a physician named Dr. Rutherford Stewart, who had officially retired from the coroner's office 2 years before, but still served on the most serious cases because no one else in the county had his experience. Dr. Stewart was 68, a thin, white-haired man with a clipped manner of speaking and pale eyes that missed little. He had been a surgeon in the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg, Chickamauga, and through the long, terrible winter of the siege of Petersburg, he had seen more death than most men could imagine. He approached the broken wall with a handkerchief pressed to his nose and mouth, went inside with a kerosene lantern, and came out 11 minutes later with an expression the sheriff would describe in his report as the look of a man who had just been shown something he hoped never to see. He walked a short distance, leaned against a live oak, and stood there for 2 full minutes without speaking. When he turned back, his voice was steady, but his hands were not. What Dr. Stewart found inside that cabin, and what he would document in the county coroner's report of October 30th, 1908 was this. The cabin was a single room, approximately 12 by 14 feet, with a packed earth floor, a small hearth at one end, and a narrow loft accessed by a wooden ladder. The interior had been stripped of all furniture except a single iron bed frame against the far wall. On the bed frame, arranged with a care Dr. Stewart found the most disturbing element of the entire scene, were the remains of 2 human beings. One was an adult female, determined by the dimensions of the pelvis and the development of the skull to have been approximately 18 to 25 years old at death. The other was a child male, between 7 and 9 years old. The remains had been almost entirely mummified by the sealed, dry conditions of the cabin, which had kept out moisture and scavengers for 45 years. The skin had become the color and texture of old parchment. The hair was still attached. The clothing, a simple cotton dress on the woman, a linen shirt and wool trousers on the boy, was intact, though faded and brittle. The woman's arms were positioned around the child, whose head rested against her shoulder. They had been placed that way after death. Dr. Stewart was certain, because the arrangement was too composed to have occurred during any struggle. Someone, he noted in his report, had taken the time to lay them together in a posture approximating rest, and then had built a wall around them, and then had gone home. On the skull of the woman, at the left temple, there was a clearly visible fracture consistent with a single heavy blow from a blunt object. On the skull of the child, at the back of the head, a similar fracture. The bones were otherwise intact, with no evidence of struggle. No defensive wounds to the forearms, no displaced limbs. Whatever had been done to them had been done quickly. A mercy of a kind, Dr. Stewart wrote, though the word mercy was not one he used without discomfort in this context. On a small wooden table beside the bed, brittle with age but still legible, a notarized bill of manumission dated January 15, 1863, signed by Augustine Ravenel, granting freedom to one Delia, 22 years of age, and her son Isaac, 8 years of age. The document bore the seal of a Charleston notary, Francis Gadsden, who had died in 1879, but whose records, preserved in the Charleston County Archives, matched the signature exactly. Beside the paper lay a small leather pouch containing 37 silver coins, mostly Mexican and Spanish pieces of 8, dated between 1821 and 1859. A year's wages for a free laborer in 1863, enough to begin a life, if willing to work, and careful. Beside the pouch, a single object wrapped in muslin, a child's wooden horse carved from what looked like live oak, smoothed by years of a small palm closing around it, the mane carved in fine detail, the tail notched with care. Stuck to the underside, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were 2 initials, I.R., Isaac Ravenel. Dr. Stewart came out of the cabin and sat down on the earth beside Solomon Pinckney and did not speak for a long time. The 2 old men, the white doctor and the black freedman, sat side by side on the ground in the October sunlight, without looking at each other, the sheriff and the remaining workmen standing a respectful distance away. At last, Solomon looked at him and asked, in the careful voice he had used to speak to white men all his life, whether the bodies were of a woman and a boy. Dr. Stewart said yes. Solomon asked whether the boy had light hair. Dr. Stewart said he could not be certain due to the condition of the remains, but what hair was present appeared fair. Solomon nodded once, and then he began to cry. He was 76. He had not cried, according to his grandchildren, later interviewed, in any of their lifetimes. He cried without sound for nearly 20 minutes. Then he stood up, put his hat back on, and told Sheriff Hayward and Dr. Stewart what he had heard on the night of January 17, 1863. He told it slowly, in the same careful voice, stopping twice for water. He named the men, described the sounds, and, with an accuracy later corroborated by the coroner's findings, exactly where the bodies had been placed on the bed, which one had been killed first, and how he knew. When he finished, Sheriff Hayward took off his own hat, and the three men stood together in the long October shadows and did not speak for a long time. The investigation that followed lasted exactly 17 days, and then it was over. The Beaufort County Sheriff, Oscar Hayward, took Solomon Pinckney's statement on October 29, 1908, and filed it with the county court. Dr. Stewart filed his coroner's report on the 30th. Both documents clearly named Augustine Ravenel, deceased in 1863, as the probable perpetrator, and named two further individuals unidentified as his accomplices. The local paper, the Beaufort Gazette, ran a story on October 31st under the headline, "Grim Discovery at Old Raven Place," describing the finding of the remains and alluding, in the careful language of 1908 South Carolina, to the possibility a crime had been committed. The Charleston News and Courier picked up the story on November 2nd. A reporter from the Savannah Morning News came to Beaufort County on November 4th and interviewed Solomon Pinckney at length. Then, on November 17, 1908, the story disappeared. The Beaufort Gazette ran no further articles. The Charleston News and Courier printed a brief notice on its back page stating the remains had been interred at county expense in an unmarked grave at a nearby cemetery, and no further investigation was warranted given the death of the principal suspect 45 years earlier. The Savannah Morning News never ran the interview its reporter had conducted. When Solomon Pinckney's grandson, Samuel Pinckney, attempted in 1934 to obtain Sheriff Hayward's original report from the Beaufort County Courthouse, he was told the file could not be located. What happened? It is now possible to piece together from later evidence. Clotilda Ravenel, the daughter of Augustine and Henrietta, was by 1908 a widow living in Charleston, mother of 3 sons, 2 of whom were prominent in South Carolina politics. Her brother Augustine Jr. had died in 1901, but his sons, her nephews, were officers in the state banking system. The Ravenel family had, in the 45 years since the war, rebuilt its fortune through timber, banking, and marriage. It was not a family that could afford a newspaper story circulating about a murder committed by its patriarch. Through mechanisms never documented, but not difficult to imagine, the story was made to go away. Sheriff Hayward, who ran for re-election in 1910, did not mention the case in his campaign. Dr. Stewart, who died in 1912, never spoke of it publicly. The reporter from the Savannah Morning News was reassigned to the agricultural desk and left the paper within the year. What the Ravenel family could not control was Solomon Pinckney. Solomon lived until 1927, 79 years old at his death, and in the last decades of his life, he told the story of what he had heard through the wall on the night of January 17, 1863, to anyone who would listen. His children, his grandchildren, his church at the African Methodist Episcopal Congregation in Green Pond, and on one occasion in 1921, to a young graduate student from Fisk University, traveling through the Lowcountry collecting oral histories of formerly enslaved people, whose notebooks were eventually deposited in a university archive and not catalogued until the 1970s. Solomon insisted every time he told it on 3 points. First, that Delia had been told she was being freed and believed it, until the moment the other 2 men came into the cabin. Second, that the child Isaac had died knowing he was being taken to see the ocean. And third, that Augustine Ravenel had sealed the cabin not out of shame, but out of calculation. He had sealed it because a living woman and a living child, both free, and both carrying the evidence of his paternity, could destroy him and his family in a way the corpses behind a plank wall never could. Augustine Ravenel had murdered them not to hide the evidence of his crimes against Delia, but because the imminent arrival of the Union Army was about to make her testimony and her son's face into weapons that could be used against him in a court of law and public opinion. A free Delia walking into a Union camp in the summer of 1863 with a light-skinned boy by her hand and a manumission paper in her pocket would have been one of the most devastating witnesses in the history of the Lowcountry. Augustine Ravenel had done the arithmetic of his class and time and decided it was easier to seal two human beings into a wooden box than to face the consequences of having treated them as human beings in the first place. The manumission paper, it turned out, had been real. He had paid to have it drawn up. He had gone through the legal motions of freeing them. Then, on the night he promised them freedom, he killed them. The paper in the cabin was not evidence of a generous impulse gone wrong. It was evidence of a trap set with care. Delia had believed she was free because Augustine Ravenel showed her the paper and let her read it. And once she believed it, once she woke her son and told him they were going to see the ocean, he let in the men who made certain no such journey would ever be taken. The woman and the child in the cabin were buried, as the Charleston News and Courier had reported, in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. In 1998, the Pinckney family, working with a historical preservation society and a team of forensic archaeologists from the University of South Carolina, located the grave in 2003 after 5 years of legal wrangling with the county. The remains were disinterred, re-identified through careful comparison with the surviving 1908 coroner's photographs, and reinterred with headstones. The headstones are plain gray granite, each carved with a single name. And for the first time in either of their lives, a date of death. Delia, 1841, January 17, 1863. Isaac, 1854, January 17, 1863. Alongside them is a third stone, added by the Pinckney family in 2004. Reading in simple lettering, they were told they were free. He lied. Solomon Pinckney heard it through the wall and remembered the Ravenel Bluff property was developed in the 1950s into a planned subdivision of vacation homes. The main house had burned in a lightning storm in 1931 and was never rebuilt. The slave quarters, including the cabin at the end of the row, were torn down after the 1908 investigation, their timbers hauled away and burned in a brush pile at the edge of what had been the rice field. There is a historical marker now, placed in 2009 at the turnoff from the old river road, noting the existence of the plantation, the names of the people enslaved there, and the discovery of 1908. It does not name the Ravenel family, but the descendants of Augustine Ravenel still live in Charleston. The bank he helped found still operates under a different name on Broad Street. His great-great-grandchildren sit on boards of charitable foundations, give to historical preservation societies, and have in the last several years been asked to contribute to the maintenance of the cemetery where Delia and Isaac now lie. They have, to their credit, quietly done so. The money comes through a trust with no family name attached. It was the granddaughter of Clotilda Ravenel, a historian in her 70s, who had spent her career studying the Lowcountry rice economy, who arranged the trust in 2007. She never spoke publicly about the case, but in a letter to the director of the Historical Preservation Society, released with her permission after her death in 2019, she wrote only this: "My great-grandfather built a wall. It was never going to be strong enough. The voices of the people he sealed behind it have been speaking for 150 years, and my family has been listening, whether we admitted it or not. It is past time we answered." There are plantations like Ravenel Bluff up and down the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, places where cabins have all been torn down. Fields grown up in pine, where behind polite historical markers are stories sealed in darkness by men who thought they could outlast the memory of what they had done. Some of those stories have come out. Most have not. The cabin at Ravenel Bluff is only one of them. And if the story of Delia and Isaac proves anything, it proves walls do not hold forever. The men who build them die, and the voices they tried to silence reach the next generation, and the generation after that, through the patience of witnesses like Solomon Pinckney, who listened through a plank wall at 15 and carried what he heard for 60 years until the daylight came. What do you think of this story? Do you believe every wall eventually falls, or are there crimes that will stay buried forever? Leave your comment below. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who understands that American history is not only what was written in ledgers, but what was whispered through walls.